Thank you so much for having me on your program and for the great your work you're doing to raise awareness collectively about Iran. My name is Banafsheh Keynoush, and I am the editor and an author of the forthcoming book, Iran's Interregional Dynamics in the Near East, which comes out on April 15th. And I am also the author of Saudi Arabia and Iran, Friends or Foes, which was published back in 2016. Um, I have a foot in academia and a foot in the policy world.
That's great. Thank you so much, Banafsheh, for joining us today. And I'm really excited to speak with you and to hear more about your work and about the upcoming book as well, of course. I think it's great to meet you. And as we were mentioning earlier, it's funny during lockdown, I feel that we're more connected. So I'm really pleased that we're making this connection. And thank you for your kind words for the Iranian Studies Collective. It means a lot to me. And perhaps as a way to start, we can maybe look at your first book, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I'd be very interested to know more about your approach to the relationship. I think the way you framed it, whether friends or foe, perhaps you can maybe have it. Do you have an answer for that? Are they friends? Are they foes?
Absolutely. As the framer of this question, I better have an answer for you.
Yes.
So, if you look at their relationship from the early 20th century onward, they have they've never been meant to be friends or foes. The
Mm,
relationship between them is based on an understanding on the need to preserve a relative balance of power between the two. And amazingly, as neighbors, as two countries that share a common faith, share a very important waterway, and
mhm,
share, therefore, the security of the waterway and the region, they have an inherent understanding about the need. For this balance. And my book looks into the historic interactions in the early 20th century,
mm,
right before and after their formal relations were established, um, to sort of bring this narrative out of how important it was even back then for them to reach out to one
mm,
another. But
mhm,
as we know, the Persian Gulf is also susceptible to enormous amounts of external influence. And it's when this
mhm,
external influence comes in and through a series of policies or policy miscalculations exacerbates regional power imbalances, that the rivalries between Saudi Arabia and Iran flare up. And I look
mm,
into this story and the balance of power between the two countries pretty much from the early 20th century to the present time. And in my second book, which we are talking more about today, I have written a chapter about the Saudi Iranian relationship where it stands today. And
mhm,
again, I argue that efforts to build multilateralism, for example, in the region, among the regional states and including Saudi Arabia and Iran, will only lead to a fragmented form of multilateralism if the
mhm.
underlying imbalances of power are not addressed by the same
Right.
powers, external powers, who
Mhm,
go in and
mhm,
disrupt that balance of power to begin with. Um,
mm,
and so, therefore, other attempts at, for example, niche diplomacy. Let's talk, for
mhm,
example, about the Hormuz peace initiative
mhm,
forwarded by Iran recently, or the building of Middle East free of nuclear weapons. As lofty and as ideal as these goals
mhm,
are, they really are temporary remedies to a very deep wound, which is that imbalance of power
mm,
that must be restored and redressed. And that's a very tall and order and a very difficult task,
mhm, mhm.
but it's necessary.
Yes, yeah, of course, and I think it is necessary, and and I know in your book you sort of try and break down this idea that it's a sectarian divide that they have, but rather that there's it's more of a power imbalance. But I mean, is there some truth to the Shiite Sunni divide between them? I mean, Does that play a part at all in that imbalance?
Where amazingly, when they decided to set up their diplomatic relations, that played a very almost non-existential role in the decision for the two countries to establish formal
Mm,
relations. Their concerns were more about how to facilitate the pilgrimage for Iranian
right. Oh,
pilgrims
yes, of
to Mecca,
course.
to ensure their security. And King Abdulaziz was better at ensuring that security for the pilgrims.
Mm,
Unlike the Hashemites, Iranian pilgrims used to have a lot more face a lot more security challenges under the
I see.
Hashemites. And so,
Interesting. I didn't know that.
but but back to your question, ideology or the sectarian divide is present, and it sometimes serves as a motivator to
Mm,
advance Saudi Arabia's and Iran's immediate foreign policy goals, especially when they're at
right.
odds with each other. But it's not the key driver of their relationship.
Of course.
And the two countries themselves, if you look at their history in my first book, I do that very carefully. Um, are very cautious about preventing a flare up of ideological divides.
Hmm.
But it poses not just a challenge to their relationship and their ability to build diplomacy, but it's also domestically a security challenge for both of them as well. And
Of
that's
course. Yes.
something they're
Yes.
mindful and want to prevent. And no one in the region really wants it either.
No, no, of course, especially with Sunni minorities in Iran and Shiite minorities in Saudi Arabia. No, of course. No, thank you so much for taking us through your first book. And I suppose, in a way, in many ways, it's very much connected with your upcoming book. So perhaps, if as a way to begin, you can perhaps say a little bit more of how this book came about.
Sure. So, if I may, I want to tell you how the first book came about
Yes, please, please.
because it links to the story today. I lived through the Iran Iraq War, and it was a very deadly war. And during my high school years, um, like so many others, we suffered as a result of the war.
Mm.
I remember having to study for my exams using a flashlight under
Oh, wow.
layers of blanket at 4 in the morning, so to avoid air raids and things of that sort.
Oh,
Um,
gosh.
and there was so much talk about the Saudi role in supporting Iraq um, in that war. But surprisingly, whenever I turned to someone to ask about the Saudi role, my question was immediately dismissed. Everybody was like, nobody had a clear answer about what Saudi Arabia represents, who Saudi
Hmm.
Arabia is. And in a very fascinating way, I noticed that Iranians in particular had very little understanding about Saudi Arabia as a country, about its
Mm.
people, about its culture, except for pilgrimage and
Mhm.
a few brief political interactions that didn't sound very sophisticated. So I became very
Mm.
fascinated with Saudi Arabia, and I promised myself to one day try to kind of unravel that story. And this led to the first book. And I was
I
able,
see.
to travel and spend an enormous amount of time, in the region and doing interviewing, archival research, and
Mhm.
really getting to know both countries' perspectives about each other. So
Mhm.
once that book came out, I still had a nagging feeling that I don't know enough about the region yet. And the reason
Mm.
is that I still don't know exactly what the rest of the GCC countries, for example, really think about Iran. It's
Mm.
one thing
Mhm.
to learn about what Iran's concerns are. We hear that a lot more frequently in the media. Iran is more vocal about it. There are
Mhm.
a lot
Mhm.
more Iran researchers, as you know, in
Mhm.
the academic world than
True.
any other sector, I would say, in many respects. But then, what does a small country like Oman or Kuwait or Qatar
Mm.
think about Iran?
Mm.
What
Yeah.
does Israel think about Iran? What does Jordan?
Mm.
What do the Palestinians really think about it?
Mm.
What do the Iraqis and Syrians think, and how do they see what's going on
Mm.
in Iran? And it was at that point that I had received an invitation to become a visiting scholar at Princeton. And in that job, I was asked to put together an event, and I proposed bringing people from the region to really
Mm-hmm.
talk about how the region sees Iran.
Yeah.
And so I convened and moderated a roundtable, um,
Mm-hmm.
and was able to invite academics from Turkey, from the GC
Mm-hmm.
countries and the region. And we all sat around the table for a day
Mm-hmm.
and we talked. And after that event, I invited everyone to contribute chapters to the current book.
I
And
see.
so I worked very closely with the contributors, with the authors for about a year and a half. And the
Mm-hmm.
result of that is this new book that looks into how other countries view Iran. And we challenge
Mm-hmm.
the pervasive narrative that is often taken as for granted, especially in the policy world, that Iran has tremendous influence in the region. That is not the case. What Iran has is
Mm-hmm.
um, is an ability to be persistent, but it faces challenges every step of the way in advancing its influence. And Iran's influence is not as pervasive as we think it is. Within the GCC countries, given their closer partnerships with the United States, they're less successful in even building a very cohesive relationship with Iran, and therefore they resist Iran on many fronts, all of them, while also understanding the need to engage with Iran at some level. And then countries like Turkey and Israel, for example, that are able to have their independent foreign policies, really have a selective approach toward Iran. And as a result of this, Iran is only capable of developing a piecemeal approach to developing its influence in the region. That's very different from the narrative that we assume giving Iran
Mm-hmm.
pervasive influence. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't. I don't mean to say that it doesn't exist, but that the influence doesn't exist, but where it does is not. It is not as easy or as pervasive as one assumes, and Iran has
Mm.
to fight for it every step of the way.
That's very challenging. I mean, even from my own understanding, which is I have to admit quite limited, but we have this notion that Iran is very influential. I mean, when you think of the late Soleimani and all of these people sort of there, and this presence of Iran on the ground, so we think that they're very important and that they needed to be fought. So it's very interesting to hear something very different. But I guess, as you say, we only get bits of the picture rather than the full picture, the full understanding. So I'm very excited to see that. And do you look? I mean, I know you're looking at the region itself, but do you consider the influence of outside powers on the region and on Iran's position there, namely Russia and the United States? Do you look at those as well?
That is a challenging question throughout the research, and the reason is that it's a challenging issue for the individual countries, because
Sure.
on one hand they have to develop their own policies toward Iran, but on the other hand there are a lot of uncertainties, particularly in the U.S.-Iran relationship. And so
Okay.
all these concerns, while trying to navigate their security concerns with Iran, must also navigate their concerns about, for example, the outcome of the nuclear deal.
Mm-hmm.
And that also leads to more piecemeal policies
Mm-hmm.
by Iran toward the region, and vice versa to an extent. They kind of selectively engage in Iran with Iran until they can figure all the rest of it out, and in the meantime, they have other security challenges that must be
Mm-hmm.
addressed immediately. So, what I argue that while Iran does play a prominent role in a lot of the conflicts in the region, it is not the only actor there, and it's not the most immediate concern at all times, considering that it's one piece of a larger
Mm-hmm.
picture for the region.
I see, fascinating. And I know you've contributed a chapter on Saudi Arabia and Iran, and perhaps if I could ask, what was the journey like to write that chapter, and to also for the book? I know you worked closely with the scholars, but were you able to do some research, interviews? What was the journey for writing like?
Yes, well, over the years, I have had a lot of travel to the region, and particularly Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I also interact in the policy world frequently with people from the region. And so that allowed me to formulate the arguments for the new chapter on Saudi Arabia and Iran, which, as I mentioned, looks at the fragmented nature of multilateralism in the region and tries to explain that that is because of the imbalance of power between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then I explain how that is a problem in pursuing multilateral initiatives or niche diplomacy. But then I move on from Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I have contributors from Turkey, academics from Turkey who have written a chapter on Turkey and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also a very fascinating chapter because it looks at the evolution of Turkish policy since the revolution toward Iran, and with the rise of, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it carries us through the conflict in Syria and then through the nuclear conflict with Iran and the world powers. And where
Mm-hmm.
Turkey stands on all of this is this position of needing to be very selective in how it engages with Iran because it's just too much.
Mm-hmm.
And Turkey's interests must come first, and Turkey has enough power to be able to assert its will. And so it does, or be it
Mm-hmm.
in Syria, be it with the nuclear issue, be it with the challenges of trading with Iran as a result of sanctions. And so this chapter looks at
Mm-hmm.
details. Then I have a chapter on Qatar and Iran,
Mm-hmm.
again by contributors based in Qatar. And this is the fascinating part about this book. We are all people who breed our knowledge of the region from the region and from within the
I think
region.
that's
It's
great.
very
Yeah,
important for us to
absolutely.
understand the region from the point of view of the region rather than this narrative that is passed down by external
Mm-hmm.
actors about the region, which at best is very general and very
Mm-hmm.
generic and hardly
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
deep, deep enough, I would say. And so
Mm-hmm.
on Qatar and Iran, again, we have fascinating discoveries in this chapter, including the fact that the relationship is actually more contentious than meets the eye, but
Mm-hmm.
Qatar is able to be very pragmatic about it. And
Mm-hmm.
unlike, again, popular views of a Qatari Iranian closeness that
Mm-hmm.
emerged when Qatar was placed under sanctions in 2017 by Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Egypt.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
That was actually not something that transpired. Qatar understood that its larger interests, including trade interests,
Mm-hmm.
rested elsewhere other than Iran. And it has always had
Mm-hmm.
security concerns about Iran, but it's
Sure.
pragmatic about it. And then there's a chapter
Mm-hmm.
by an academic in Kuwait, again about
Mm-hmm.
Kuwait and Iran. And there again, Kuwait prefers to have Iran on the neutral side of things, especially after its experience with the Iran-Iraq war
Mm-hmm.
and the Kuwait
Of
war.
course. Mm-hmm.
And Kuwait is also developing a role for itself as a mediator in the region. And Kuwait must also navigate very carefully its relationship with its own Shia community, a very significant community, many of
Mm-hmm.
whom are Persians by origin. And
Mm-hmm.
the fact that inside Kuwait, many Kuwaitis have issues with the Persian influence, not the sectarian Shia influence, because Kuwait
Mm-hmm.
is handling that issue quite well
Mm-hmm.
with its Shia community. Um, but really the Persian influence, because you have to remember that the Persian influence in the region predates the sectarian
Sure. Of,
influence.
of course.
That
Yes.
historically forms the memory of the region to this day, surprisingly more so than the sectarian challenge at some
Mm-hmm.
point in time. And so this chapter looks into these debates, looks at the interactions between the government of Kuwait and the different sections of the Shia community in Kuwait and how they view Iran and how the Sunnis view Iran. And then
Mm-hmm.
Kuwait's larger interests as a mediator and its desire, of course, for trade and security in the region, like all the
Mm-hmm.
rest of them. And then there's a chapter on that I have co-authored with two lovely ladies on the UAE, Bahrain, and Oman and their ties with Iran, and
Uh-huh.
how as
Uh-huh.
smaller states they try to build leverage by promoting prosperity and trying to get Iran on board a little bit if Iran is able to. Um, but at the same time, avoiding immense risks with Iran, because then that puts behind where the UAE, Oman, and Bahrain individually need to be with their economies. And then that impacts the political and diplomatic leverage that they are able to have in the region, which is very important to them because it's not about just Iran, it's also about Saudi Arabia and where they fit in the
Mm,
relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and how can they
mhm,
avoid being crushed, watching their interests
mm,
crushed as a result of the imbalance of the relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So we look at all aspects of the political,
mhm,
um, somewhat sectarian Shia issues, which is rather placid in many of these GCC states, but and the trade factors to kind of come to a conclusion of where this relationship rests. And then there's
mhm,
another chapter that I've co-authored with a colleague in the Arab world about Iran's influence in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Israel. And again, we look at what the tensions really mean for Israel. Does Israel
mm,
really seek a confrontation, a direct confrontation? And the answer is, not. It's in a difficult position and really has tried to avoid
mm,
that for a very, very long time. And so we
mm,
address the reasons for that. Why Iran is not the key player in Palestine. There are other countries that have a far more prominent role in the
mm,
Palestinian-Israeli conflict and issues there. And and that Iran's influence in Syria is essentially an influence in two conflict zones where Iran has to expend a lot of its resources and
mm,
take a lot of risks that other countries would ordinarily not take in order to remain an influencer. And so we look at how Iran's influence sometimes expands and then retracts in Syria and Iraq
mhm.
because of the enormity of the undertaking of being
Of
an
course, yeah.
influence in these two
Mhm,
conflict zones.
yeah.
So that's the story of this book.
No, that's incredible. Thank you for taking us through all of that. But and I mean, even listening to what you're saying, it's already challenging some of these preconceived ideas I have, like that Iran is this threat that needs to be fought against. So that's something that I didn't really think about. I just assumed, but didn't really realize that actually underneath all that, a lot of these states are very practical, very pragmatic, and they actually want more stability, neutral trade with Iran. But do you find that Saudi Arabia and Iran still are these two pillars of the region, and that a lot of countries feel caught between them?
Well, here's the issue. If the power imbalances between them continue, and for
Yeah.
the foreseeable future they might, they become increasingly weaker. So if you look at
Mm,
Saudi Arabia and Iran, where they were in their relationship 80 years ago, 85 years
yeah.
ago, and through the 50s, through the Arab Cold War, through the Cold War, and then in 1970s when they were regarded as twin pillars by the Nixon administration. And then after Iran's revolution, during the Iran-Iraq War, during the Gulf War, and then the invasion of Iraq in 2003, so on and so forth, which my first book does in detail, you realize that they have become less and less able in tackling the challenges between them.
Mm,
Why is that? The reason is simple. The enormous imbalance of power is forcing them to spend a lot of money and a lot of resources to stay
of
abreast
course.
of the
Yeah.
development and to
Mm,
try to scramble to gain the upper hand to ensure their security. And so they're less and less capable as regional actors to
mm,
behave in a manner that upholds the region's security collectively. So in
wow.
response to your question, as a result of this reality, what
Mm,
other countries in the region have to say will become increasingly more important. And this is
mhm,
something that Saudi Arabia and Iran are not very observant about.
mhm,
They're too used to being the main players And they
Yeah.
sometimes forget that, the
Mm,
all other players that not only have
mhm,
other interests, and I think Saudi Arabia and Iran are kind of aware of that, but they really don't really, especially in Iran's case. Saudi Arabia is a lot more aware because it's an Arab country dealing with
mm,
its Arab neighbors, and they interact on a whole different level than Iran is
mhm,
able to. But Iran really has no knowledge or deep understanding about
mm,
how it's really looked of its shortcomings
mm.
vis-a-vis a small country like the UAE,
Right.
vis-a-vis Oman, which it likes to think of as a friend, or Qatar, but and it doesn't all the time. It has its reservations, but I would say Iran is is losing a lot of opportunities
Mm,
at diplomacy and at
mm.
self-correcting its regional course as a result of being unaware of what is going on.
Right, right. No, that's fascinating and really important and a very important point. And I suppose that kind of leads me to my next question about what were the main surprises that you came across when writing this book, or co-writing as well the chapters. Would that be it? That Iran is not as aware as it could be?
That is one of them, one of the key
Yeah.
ones, I would say.
Mm,
And Iran has a lot of learning to do in this process
right.
because it's so preoccupied with advancing its own security interests and influence that it's harder for it to step back and take a, bigger, wider look at the region and where it's going.
Mm-hmm.
And really assess carefully its comparative advantage and
Mm-hmm.
weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Any careful non-risk taking actor should do that. But
Right.
Iran takes too many risks, and it's willing to pay the price no matter what. And
Mm,
it thinks that it's the right course, but it hasn't had time to step back and think otherwise in so many ways. And frankly, it's not all its fault. It also feels very isolated in the
right.
region, given the U.S. pressures, etc. But another
Of course.
surprise of this journey, research journey, and writing journey, was to understand that, first of all, the region is immensely preoccupied with what the US does next with Iran. But at the same
Mm,
time, they're not waiting for it to
mm-hmm.
happen any longer.
Right.
They have learned to move ahead with their own interests,
Mm-hmm.
and so the book shows exactly where these movements are occurring, even in Saudi Arabia. Um, and so that was a discovery as well. So here we are in
Mm,
the US. Oftentimes we talk about the US interests in the Middle East, the US interests about
mm-hmm.
Iran. But
Mm-hmm.
when you really look at it from the region, they're a little bit past that phase. And
Mm,
since the Trump presidency and now the pandemic and the internal weakness at home that we feel in the United States, and the need to reverse so many of our policies domestically and
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
externally, that's something the region is quite aware of. And so while we are pondering as where we stand in the world as America, the rest of the region feels like it's kind of ready to move beyond that.
Mm. No, that's unexpected. But I suppose we well, even in the UK, we do see things from the American perspective.
Ah,
And often the case we look at what is the US's interest in the Middle East, and these players seem almost at the receiving end of things. So it's nice that your book seems to give agency to the states themselves in their own in dictating the regional dynamics. So that's very cool. And I was wondering, just out of my own curiosity, does your book cover the UAE Israeli improvement of relations as well?
no, it does not,
Mm.
because the book is published on April 15, and as
That's
you
a
know,
bit
the
after.
publication stage
Of
takes a year
course.
itself.
Yeah,
So
of
this book
course. Yeah.
was submitted to the publisher, I believe, sometime last summer, or
Right.
I don't really exactly. So it does not, but
Mm.
the findings of the book are still very relevant.
Oh, no, definitely. No, no, I'm just curious.
But
Yeah.
but also relevant in terms of showing the independent foreign policy path that the UAE is trying to take,
Yeah.
and hence
Mm.
I do. try to delve into that a bit more in, in writing articles, and but not in the book
Yeah.
itself.
No, but I'm just curious. I mean, how do you think that would affect the power dynamics of the region? I mean, is that a
Yeah.
do you think other states will do the same with Israel?
It remains to be seen. I mean, I would say
Mm,
that's not the main, if I may humbly submit, may not be the main question. This is a
mm-hmm,
region that is driven by its investments and where its trade and
mm-hmm.
money is very critical for the stability of this region.
Yeah,
So
of
where the
course.
money goes is comes first before
Mm-hmm,
any other thing. And that money can only flow in the event of security and stability, in which Iran
mm-hmm.
a role. So, with regard to Israel, I think the normalization of the region's relations with Israel are a sub-factor of this larger reality that I
Mm-hmm,
described. And
mm-hmm.
therefore, it remains to be seen how much it will actually shift the traditional power dynamics in the region. And if we have time, I'll speak briefly about that.
Yes,
But
please.
that, that is, these traditional power dynamics rested on the Arab core, the way the colonial powers viewed it, the
Of
Arab
course.
core, and then the three periphery states, Israel, Iran, and Turkey. And these three periphery states have always feared the Arab core. Remember that Israel had several wars with the Arab world. Iran itself has had a major
Mm-hmm.
war with
Yeah.
with Iraq, and
Yes,
so on and
true.
so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And just look at the tensions between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
the UAE. So fundamentally, there's an unspoken understanding between Turkey, Iran, and Israel, that they cannot afford to weaken each other irreversibly to the point of granting the Arab core an upper hand over them.
Ah, I see.
And this
Right.
doesn't necessarily mean they sit down and talk about it,
No.
but but when they are thinking about their own individual policies, they need to factor that reality. And so, in the case of Israel's normalization with the region, that is one reason why Israel is asserting will on this normalization process.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about Israeli investments, where Israel wants its investments to go, and countries like
Mm-hmm.
the UAE are able to be players in that investment world. But
Right.
does that investment translate into a shift of power remains to be seen.
Mm.
Saudi Arabia and where it goes with this issue, um, will be a key player. Saudi Arabia, as you know, many of Saudi Arabia's allies in the coalitions that Saudi Arabia has built, the military coalitions, have begun normalizing ties with Israel, including a number of countries in Africa where Iran has also tried to influence. So slowly the paradigms are shifting. The paradigms
Mm-hmm.
of power are shifting. And if
Mm-hmm.
they can be sustained, they will matter. And Iran is increasingly feeling alarmed by it. Whereas in the old days, Israel used to be a little bit farther
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
around the Golan Heights, and it had to go through
Yeah.
Syria first, where Iran was already present. Now
Mm-hmm.
Israel is a lot closer in the
Yeah.
UAE, with this,
Mm.
in the Red Sea, and
Mm-hmm.
so I think that is a
Mm.
fascinating area to explore more.
Very, very, very fascinating and something to follow, I suppose, in the next years. No, it's been really incredible just talking to you and listening. I feel like I'm learning so much. It's like getting my own personal tutorial, so I'm very grateful for that. But perhaps as a final question, I think this book's going to be very important for scholars, politicians, journalists, anyone who's generally interested in the region. And I definitely see it as a big contribution to the scholarship to scholarship. But I'm wondering, where do you see the book? Who would you like to read? Who would you like to read? Who would your reader like to be? Sorry, I couldn't say that in English.
Absolutely. Well, allow me to speak from my heart. I'm very thankful for
Please.
being interviewed by you, by an academic, because I, as an academic, sense the sophistication of the questions and the perspectives that you bring to the fore. And I really appreciate that.
No,
I would
no,
like to
you're
thank
very kind.
intellectual conversation with you that you have created and built.
That's kind.
Secondly,
Thank you.
I write from the heart. Before I am an academic or a policy person, I am always driven by my heart. When I lived in the Iran-Iraq War, I made a hard decision to write about Saudi Arabia one
Mm,
day, and I did. And with this book,
mm,
I I have always wanted to build understanding between the region and Iran, a better
mhm,
understanding between the Arab world, between Turkey. So my hope is that policymakers, politicians, world leaders,
mm,
I've interacted with a fair number of them, and maybe you won't be surprised, but they really often understand so little about
mm,
uh, while they gain a level of sophistication given the amount of power and decisions at their disposal, they still need to be informed. And I
yeah.
mean this in a very humble way by everyone, by journalists, by academics. It
Mhm,
is our
mhm,
responsibility to inform world leaders and policymakers. So
mhm,
they are my first and main audience, as are
mhm,
of course academics, given the major academic contribution in each individual chapter
mhm,
that
mhm,
this book presents. But it's also an accessible book. It's easy flow of writing.
mhm,
Um, I personally follow Ernest Hemingway as my model of authors, of
mm, mhm,
people. I like easy writing. I like
mhm,
easy reading, and this book is very good for senior scholars and graduate students. But I think that a group of undergraduate students might also find it useful, and of course the
mhm,
public. If anybody wants to learn about the UAE-Iran relations, if they are
mm,
a journalist or you know just want to get a quick tutorial, each and
mm,
every chapter gives you a quick tutorial of the relationship with Iran from the beginning of the revolution until after the US withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018
mm.
and the consequences of that.
Oh, that's great. I mean, it's nice in a way. It's a good handbook, as you
Yes.
said, like a quick, not quick, but an in-depth understanding. I think it'll be very useful, and I really hope that the right people read it as well, because I think it's very important. I mean, knowledge is power, and and it's the only way that we can build bridges is if we have a better understanding of that. So I really appreciate that, and I think it's going to be an amazing book and an incredible contribution. So thank you so much for writing it and putting it all together, and thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I think anyone watching this video is also going to feel the same way.
Well, I have to thank you very much as well for your time and for making this effort to have me. So it's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much.